All right, welcome in another edition of the Ryan and Goodman podcast. I'm Jeff Goodman. He's Bob Ryan. And this is Sam Smith. And I'm sure you are familiar with him by now, no matter who you are, no matter what age you are, no matter what generation you are and what generation you watched in the NBA. I've got my Jordan Rules copy on my desk here, and I know Bob has his as well. And we really appreciate you, Sam, joining us. We know you've been busy.
And the best thing,
listen, the best thing, we set you up on Zoom, so you should be forever indebted to us.
and that's going to be actually the most amazing thing of this, that people are going to look and say, you got Sam Smith to figure out Zoom.
Listen,
we can solve the virus now.
I got Bob Ryan and Sam Smith. Like this is like world peace, what I've done.
This is General Sarnoff here, Sam. This guy is a technical whiz.
It's time to have him work on the virus now.
Okay, that's right.
So what's your life been like, Sam, since this doc started that is aired on ESPN, and we're 4 episodes in, and you are the most relevant media member on the face of the planet over the last couple of weeks. What's life been like?
You're naive in a sense, just like when the Jordan Rules came out. It was so unexpected to me at the time because, as Bob probably knows, when you're going through something, when you're dealing something and it's your day-to-day life, it's not special because you say, well, that's just me. What's the big deal? I'm doing it. It's like when I was at the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln is kind of droning on and it's raining and I'm going, let's get this over with already. Yeah, and so. We knew about, actually, when they came around last year and did the interview for the documentary, they were saying The Last Dance and 90, and I'm thinking to myself, 10 parts on 97, 98, it wasn't that interesting. So I wasn't thinking about, being going through the whole dynasty, which obviously made sense. And like I think I told you a little before we were talking, Jeff, I feel like, I've been in the same place. I've been to Chicago Tribune since left in 2008, and now I write for the Bulls website, which has been great for me. But I feel like I've been in the same spot, and the circus just came back to where I was standing. I didn't do anything, and all of a sudden, all these characters showed up again, jumping around, on trapezes and making all these spectacular things. And I'm saying, whoa, I'm right in the middle of it again.
How long did they interview for, Sam?
It was interesting how it happened, Bob. And it would have been fine. I've written 3 books on Jordan. I wrote one about 4 or 5 years ago called There Is No Next, and sort of my view of the end of my Homeric trilogy, which was not quite Homer, but it was about, okay, I'm wrapping this thing up in an oral history of his career, and it came out well. And so then they were doing, and so I've done enough Jordan kind of thing, and I feel like, okay, let me move on here. And so they had done a lot of, people had been asking me, Phil, who I keep in touch with, had done an interviews, and Jerry Reinsdorf, who I see around with the Bulls, and some of the players, and they had never reached out to me. So I thought, this is great. I don't really want to deal with this. I don't want to get involved, and I had enough when the Jordan Rules came out and everything that succeeded through then. And then they came around kind of late, about last fall. I guess it was in the fall. They called and said, hey, can we sit down and do something? And you know how it is, Bob. You do a lot of these documentaries, the bad boy things, and I'm sure you did with Bird and the Magic. And, they talk to you for 2 hours, and then you're on screen for like 11 seconds.
Yeah.
And so you never really think much of it. They say, oh, yeah, and I knew they were doing like 100 interviews, and they were talking to celebrities and, these rapper guys from Chicago, Kanye West, or people I've never heard of, who grew up in Chicago. And I know these people are all in it. So I'm figuring I'm not going to be in this thing, Phil and Reinsdorf and, Scottie and all, so I don't even remember what they were at, and I was been watching it. I've been thinking, well, oh, I said that. That's interesting. I didn't know I said that. So it actually toward the end, they were a little uncomfortable with it, but so the guy was talking to me. We were having a nice talk for a couple hours. And then toward the end, because I realized, they hadn't been around, I said, well, hey, let me ask you something. Because my history with Michael, I said, did you have to ask Michael, permission to talk to me? And he's kind of buffered around a little bit. He says, well, we didn't have to, but we did. And I said, well, what'd he say? He said, well, I don't give a crap who you talk to. Talk to whoever you want.
Wow. I'm
Well,
surprised.
I did a little research here on you, Mr. Smith, and at the time of the Jordan rules, you correct me. I want to see if this is the way it went. That you approached him and said, that laid it out. If you have a problem, let me. You had one conversation with him, and never again did he bring it up through the rest of your time covering the Bulls. Is that the way it worked out?
Yeah. Yes and no. We never had a conversation about the book. Never once. He's never said a word about it. He's never asked me about it. He's been very professional about it. Because I was on the beat, back on the beat.
Oh, yeah, you had a long time to go with him after that.
I never left. And so what happened was I actually was, which was the one little resentment I always have when people say, well, there was a deep throat. There's a Horace Grant was your deep throat or something, which was completely on. When I started in journalism, I was a government and investigative reporter, first in Washington, Indiana, and then in Washington, D.C. And I covered Congress for about 4 years and did investigative projects. And so then I got into sports, in a large part influenced by Bob Ryan, who I read for many years at the Globe. And I used to go down the newsstand in Washington and pick up the Sunday Globe and read all those great Sunday Notes columns. And, Bob was one of my inspirations for what I wanted to do when I got into sports. So then from my investigative work and my first editor, when I was doing that work, made a point. He said, well, if you would write these stories, people could go to jail, you've changed people's lives. You got to go and see them the day the story comes out. You go stand in front of them and you say to them, because in effect, the symbolism was, you have to stand behind what you write. And that was always the message to me. So when the book came out, it was chaos in Chicago because the narrative was, the run's over. This is a one and done now because Sam Smith has blown up the team. He's exposed all this internal division and they can never win. And too bad, Chicago. If you got anybody to blame, he's the guy. Anyways, so things were a little tense at the time. But anyway, so I walked up to Jordan in the locker room, and you remember, Bob, the scene. The players were always going through their tickets. He's got all his tickets. He's got his head down. And I said, hey, just want to let you know that I'm going to be here. If you got any questions, if you got any problems with here, I'm here. I'll talk to you about it, whatever. He never looked up, never said a word. But and it was interesting. A couple of the other players, because they're watching now. Everybody's watching this.
Oh, yeah.
And then Bill Cartwright of BJ, Dennis Hobson, and called, hey, Sam, come on over here, and I went over and chatted. And, because even though, and I think you've seen the divisions come out, and Michael's been fine with them because his point was, hey, I had to help, I had to be a leader. Leader is not your good friend. Leader has to help you, drag you to the next step. As you know, Bob, Larry wasn't exactly the closest all the time with Kevin or anything. Mm-hmm. But the point was, what can I do to help motivate my team? And I think, that was part of the thing. But a lot of those guys back then didn't always appreciate, the way Michael, I would say took him for granted, but, with his sharp tongue, kind of pushed him in his way. But to Michael's credit then, because nobody's winning a fight with Michael Jordan if you get in a fight with Michael Jordan. And it wasn't my idea to create a feud or anything, and I was still going to be there. So I still had to ask questions, and he would answer me like he did anyone else. Hey, Sam, sometimes he'd say, Sam, yeah, that's true, or something like that. Never could have, he could have done a Rasheed Wallace or Russell Westbrook, next question. Mm-hmm. A lot of the immature stuff that you see in this era or previous eras, and never did any of that, but never once has said anything to me about that book.
What's your relationship with him now, Sam? And has it just been I assume you haven't dealt with him much over the years, but if you've seen him, when you've seen him, has it just been a professional kind of relationship now where you say hello and move on?
Well, what I did after the book came out, I realized I'm going to have to be there. And we had a good relationship in the 80s when I'm traveling. And I think that's why he was bothered in effect. But, as you guys know, you're not there to be their friends. And we weren't friends. We were business friends, in that sense. But I was still a journalist and I was doing my job. I was there for the public. I was there not to protect him. But he felt that I violated trust by, in effect, I wouldn't say we were close, but, back then you're traveling together all the time. You go out to dinner with guys. And I didn't violate any of those. The point of the Jordan rules was it's about basketball. And it's about interrelationships within basketball. I didn't write about any off the court stuff. I didn't write about his family or wives, children, none of that. All the stuff that you could tell he's kept out of this documentary. There's nothing about his marriage. There's been nothing about his kids. And so there was none of that in any of the books either, basically. And so, I felt that I did, for him, a fair journalistic job. But anyway, so from that point on, there was no more small talk. Hey, Mike, you missed this shot or something. Because you'd say something to him back then. We could joke. And then, of course, he would come back with a line and he would go out and hit 4 shots in a row and point to you and say, see, you didn't know what you're talking about. And, like that little scene they played where he came up to me and the other beat writers before the game and said, he knows our predictions. He knows we all predict him to do. Took care of you. Now it's your turn. Yep. He did that stuff all the time, and stuff you never saw from anybody. Larry would do that stuff.
I was going to say, right, the two of you had this. I mean, the two of you had trash-talking, elite-level superstars that you heard that, and most people didn't. That to me is fascinating.
No, right? That wasn't Magic or Julius. That was Larry or Michael.
Yes.
No, it's interesting how these figures, Jeff, they fall into your life. I was 10 years into the job when Larry walked in, and I wasn't prepared for the scope of what it was going to mean for my career, in a sense. I wound up writing more words about Larry Bird than any other subject in a 44-year career of writing. I'm still writing occasionally on Sundays still, so it's ongoing. But Larry Bird I didn't know that was going to happen in 1979 when he walked into my life. And obviously, Sam, you had no idea, God, way back when, that there was going to be a figure that would, such as Michael Jordan. You didn't know it was going to be Michael Jordan. But
no, and he didn't, interesting.
You had no idea these kind of people are going to walk into your life.
Right. And you're right. And it envelops it. And, Michael always used to joke when things come up. He said, there you all are making money on me. And of course we would say, well, you seem to be doing pretty well too. But that first week, interestingly, I went up to do the feature in his apartment. So I walk in and he's ironing. And I think this is a put on, for the story. He wants to give me, something in color to write about it. I said, what's the deal with the ironing board? He said, well, I iron my clothes. I said, it's bull, it's just for me, right? No. He said, in high school, I never dated much and I got these big ears and, I was embarrassed by my looks. And so I never thought I'm getting married. So I took home economics, so he said, I do my ironing and I do my sewing and cooking, I do all that stuff. Now, of course, he didn't have to, as it turned out years later, but that, that's how sort of innocent he was, and probably in a lot of respects how Larry was when he first came.
Larry's answer to that was he cut his own lawn.
Right.
You could drive by Newton Street and see him out there. It's the neighbor's home. And that was because, well, he was cheap. He wasn't going to hire anybody to do something he could do himself. I said thrifty. That's a better word. That's a more polite way of putting it.
So was Michael.
But he was very thrifty. But anyway, that was a common touch that he never lost, ever, Larry. And anyway, but that's interesting. How did Phil react to the book?
It was interesting, Phil is obviously a great part of the book. And if you read the book, you see, it really, he's probably the hero of the book. Because the narrative of the story, in effect, is you've got this individual guy who's this great star that overshadows everybody. Michael Jordan's, shadow erases everybody else. And here's Phil trying to drag him along to this concept, which, even he talked about, in the documentary they've showed where he doubted the triangle the concept, equal opportunity offense. He made light of, don't throw the ball to Bill. Why do I want Bill Cartwright with the ball with 5 seconds to go? Where he, can't. And so, all these elements that Phil is trying to bring to Michael, and I knew Phil actually. When I first got into sports in the early '80s, I did a Continental Basketball Association feature where I went to Albany, with a team that was in Gary, Indiana, and spent a lot of time with Phil and Charlie Rosen with the Albany Patroons. So Phil kind of became my old-timer NBA contact. So when I was doing some NBA stuff, I'd call Phil and get some back. So and I got to know him well when he came, to be an assistant with Chicago, of all things. And, and then when he was having issues with Doug, he would call me at night and we would talk about. So I knew I developed a strong relationship with Phil before some of the others, in effect. And then I think what Phil realized, and I'm not sure, we've never talked about this, Phil or I, but my sense was, because he was filling me in on a lot of stuff. He had to be. If you read that book, I had a lot of background that is coming from people that were not players. And I knew Johnny Bach for years. He's from Brooklyn, and I'd known him for many years. And we traveled back then, Bob. We were in coach. So,
positive.
They didn't name it for the coaches, but we sat with the coaches. So I always had a seat, between Johnny and Tex. So I was always sitting on the plane getting, Tex would bring me the original version of the triple post offense book he wrote, literally the one he signed for his mother. And he would open it and show me, and we go through pages and he'd explain me the rules. And so, I'm sitting in this group of people on the plane all the time getting this basketball education. It was remarkable. You can't get anything like that anymore. It was amazing.
Right, I can relate to that. Yeah, exactly.
I've always felt that, Phil, as smart as he was, realized Michael was growing so big and he had to draw him back to the group, keep him in the crowd. And one tactic I thought he used, and, I'm sure Jerry Krause didn't like it as well, is that, hey, you got to trust us, trust the group, trust the team. And in effect, that was the message with the triangle. It's about the group. It's about everyone. So if you make the outsiders the enemy, management, the media, all these, you look inside. So I thought Phil was operating on so many different levels that sometimes he would tell me things that ended up in the newspaper or book that were designed to bring Michael back toward the group and make us look as the outsiders looking to undermine him. I don't know if that's true, but Phil is so sharp about things like that and thinks on so many levels that I wouldn't be surprised if he was doing that. Now it helped. I didn't answer because I was getting great information out of him.
Jerry Krause has become set up as the villain, and of course, you can't deny. We can't, and he can't from his grave deny.
Loved you, Bob. You know that. Loved you. Hated most of us. Loved you.
Yeah, thank you for me. I was going to have to introduce that into the conversation somewhere. We'll get to that, but he's been. I want to talk about him now. This is the Jerry Krause chapter of the Ryan Goodman podcast today with renowned Sam Smith. Yeah, he did like me, and I like Jerry, and I understand his foibles. I think I understand him very well, and there's no defense for the breakup of the team by the two Jerrys. By the way, the more important one's the one who signed the checks. Ultimately, right? So let's figure.
I can explain that one, by the way.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm defensive about the maligning he's taken here. The fact that he will not get any rebuttal for himself with between Michael and Scottie and the whole rest of the world that now has him set up as the absolute complete idiot villain. He was not an idiot. He was nobody's fool. He certainly had his personal foibles. We know that. Steve Kerr's description of saying that he couldn't get out of his own way as a person was very apt. You know it, I know
exactly,
it.
Right.
But the impression. Let me tell you, if you didn't know better, Sam, the impression that you would get from these first 4 episodes is that he was a complete doofus, and he just lucked into everything.
That's what I got. That's what I got from it.
And Sam, he inherited Michael. We know that. He inherited Michael. Everything else is him, starting with bringing Phil in as the assistant coach to Doug. And then the brilliant drafting of Pippen, the brilliant drafting of Oakley from Virginia Union, the trade of Oakley for Cartwright, and that's in round 1, and then in round 2, the phase, Paxson, Kerr, on and on. I mean, so Horace Grant, I should mention that draft. All right, I got that off my chest now. Speak, Jerry Krause. What is it? Just give me your overview of Jerry Krause.
Yeah, well, you don't have that much time in the work session for that. Michael too, as and that's part of his personality, of the edge he has, getting the last word, winning the game in effect, win the conversation, and you can see just like his Hall of Fame speech. A lot of this is about settling scores. I'm coming up too. It might turn in the Bears too. But Jerry, Isaiah.
He got Isaiah, didn't he? Oh,
right.
boy.
So you can see down the road, and you were at the Hall of Fame speech famously, where he dragged that poor kid, the high school kid who got ahead of him, dragged him to Springfield to have him stand up and say, "Hey, that's the guy who got on the varsity before me." Michael doesn't forget any of these things.
Oh, this is evident. Anyway, Jerry,
like you say, Jerry, and in a lot of ways, and only for documentary purposes, it's really actually better. And I think this will come around in your sentiment that you mentioned about Jerry. I kind of feel that's going to, eventually after everyone gets beat up for a while, defenders sort of come out and it sort of switch the other way. And I think as this goes on, there'll be more of that. But I think if Jerry were around, he'd have made a mess of trying to defend himself, and it would have been a lot worse. And it had been, look, you doth protest too much, that it must be true. And I think better that some of his defenders like you speak for him. Now, the point was, yes, if you were around them every day, it was really, really difficult. You really can't imagine. This would be, the documentary showed one scene, which I thought was reflective and part of the reason. When they were coming back from Detroit in that championship, they swept them, and now it's a, effusive team celebration. Jerry's in the middle dancing down the aisle with the other players. Yes. Now, really, come on. You're the CEO. You're the president of a corporation. Your employees are celebrating. Get out of the party. You're not supposed to be there. Jerry never understood the distinction between his office, because whatever the psychology was, the fat kid who was trying to be one of the guys when he was growing up, they, made fun of him worse. You know how it is. If the kid who is rejected tries extra hard to be part of it, and now that kid became the boss. So, in this sort of weakness of personality there, well, I'm going to take it out on all these cool kids from high school who screwed over me. And that was what not being able to get out of your own way was about. But yes, the record, if Jerry had sat back like Jerry Reinsdorf did, who was never around, you never saw any of those pictures other than when David Stern was presenting the trophy, you never saw Jerry Reinsdorf. And that's the role. That's your role when you're the executive of the team. If he stood back and stood on his accomplishments, as you mentioned, basically building a team around Michael Jordan. And of course, the frustration Michael felt was that when Jerry, Reinsdorf and hired Krause, but they took over the team in Michael's rookie season. That's when they bought the team and got control of it in, I think February of that year, fired Rod Thorne right away, let Kevin Lockery go at the end of the season. So basically Jerry's plan from that point was his dream. I'm going to rebuild this team through the draft. He traded off all these Orlando Woolridges and Juwan Oldham for draft picks, future draft picks. And how popular that was in that era. That's how Portland got number 2, Tom Owens for the pick that should have been Michael Jordan. James Worthy. All these great number ones, Estepi and Rule. So, but now Michael comes in. He's coming off North Carolina, won a championship, played for championships. He walks in, and we're going to embark on a 5-year rebuilding process around you. And so, he's trying to beat the Boston Celtics on his own. That's 86 Celtics, one of the greatest teams of all time, and looking around, and Jerry's rebuilding everything around him. So, they didn't exactly have similar paths. They was parallel paths. Jerry was working on a plan which worked out in the long run that Michael was furious about basically from day one. that you're purposely trying to lose and using me as a box office attraction while you're not giving me a chance to compete. And so that's why he's always lobbying all those years, even into the championship, that first championship season. Get rid of Pippen, get rid of Grant, get me Buck Williams, get me Walter Davis. I got to have veterans. We can't compete with the Celtics, the Pistons. These kids are not tough enough. And so, that dynamic grew between, and Michael being, much more clever, much more articulate than Jerry Krause, always had the upper edge in that. And then, of course, as we've seen even with his teammates, there's a streak of meanness in Michael too. So Jerry was no match for this, and he couldn't control, and he couldn't step back and say, look what I've done. Look how we built this team, basically all around the draft, as you pointed out. Michael didn't want to build around the draft, as most people in that era didn't.
I would think that Jerry would be a psychiatrist's dream, because no, really, the path he took, who he was, this little round fat guy, that he was not an athlete himself. He's but he worshipped sports and wound up making himself into what he did become, which was a two-sport person, because, he had extensive baseball background as well. As a matter of fact, it is alluded to in the first episode that Ryan Stork, I hired him. He was a scout of basketball. We hired him as general manager. People wouldn't, didn't realize he had an extensive basketball scouting background. But prior to that, everybody in basketball knew him.
Yeah.
You know what his official nickname is? Not Crumbs, which you unearthed and put forth to the world. But you know what it was, or you should know what it was. He's the sleuth. And Pat Williams gave him that nickname. Right. And way back when, back in the late in the 70s, when he was a functioning scout in the fraternity of scouts, Sam and Jeff, most of whom were ex-jocks. I mean, obviously, it was talking about the Bob Ferry seniors and the Gene Bumper Tormolans of the Hawks and Dickie McGuire and many others. Many of them had been NBA players and the anomaly among all of them in this fraternity, this interesting fraternity, was this short little fat guy from Chicago, from Illinois, named Jerry Krause, who didn't belong with them. It was like the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer thing. He wasn't allowed to play the reindeer games. The socialization was, he was completely the anomaly. But he was very secretive, which was the nickname that.
Bob, I'll tell you an interesting story about Jerry's background. You might not even know yourself. He was a basketball scout for the Bulls in the early 70s. He was hired actually in the late 60s under Dick Motta.
Yes.
And he had messed up several first-round picks. If you may remember back, they picked Jimmy Collins.
Yep.
Actually,
he pushed for Collins. I know that.
Over Tiny Archibald. In fact, Dick Motta always would introduce Jerry as, "Hey, I'd like you to meet Jerry Krause. He's the guy who talked me out of Tiny Archibald so I could take Jimmy Collins." And then also in the previous draft, Kennedy McIntosh, who was the #1 pick. But the point of it is, in those drafts, Jerry found Norm Van Leer and Cliff Ray. And then actually Jerry became GM of the Bulls for a year in 1976 after Motta left. And it was ill-fated because of Jerry. He was GM of the Bulls, and he tried to hire Ray Meyer as head coach.
Mm-hmm.
And his plan was to fund this unknown center, Robert Parrish from Centenary College, to be the foundation of the team. Jerry kind of gets in a controversy over Ray Meyer because DePaul gets mad. DePaul's a power in Chicago then, calls the Bulls, and Ray Meyer says, "No, it's not true. I never said I wanted the job." And Jerry gets fired over this after, maybe a year or less on the job. But he had a plan to build a team around Robert Parrish. And then you see these picks, he might have missed some of the first, but Cliff Ray, Norm Van Leer, small colleges, Earl Monroe, Winston-Salem. That's where he was the sleuth. He was at the places where nobody else wanted to go, because all the former jocks wanted to hang around together, go see the main guys, and then go drink, whereas Jerry would go off to all the places.
The historically black colleges. He was willing to tread where the others would never go. I mean, you know, whether it was the SWAC or the MEAC or the CIAA, he's the one guy that would go there unhesitatingly and fearlessly and cultivated a lot of friendships, one of which was with Big House Gaines. And of course, he wound up hiring his son, Clarence,
right,
who's still involved in the NBA as far as I know, correct? And yeah, that was his advantage, that he was willing to do that. All this is well, I'm sure will go left unsaid in this whole documentary, and it's not the point of the, you know, of his background at all. I understand that, but I'm upset that people are going to come away with a distorted impression of him. Yes, he was his own worst enemy. Yes, he just, you know, so you identified that scene was jarring, because I know very well that that's the way, that's exactly what was his problem, was injecting himself into that social circumstance where he did not belong, and where no other person of his ilk would have done it, you know, but he had this insatiable need to be me, you know. And as I said, what a psychiatrist's dream, I swear.
But also, and that's what that's why this documentary is so great. It's like a great novel, and every great novel has to have these elements of theme, character, conflict, and a villain. It's not a great story. You got the hero. You got to have the anti-hero, protagonist, antagonist. So you had to have a bad guy in it, and Jerry Krause was easily the choice.
Sam, describe for me the relationship between Michael and Scottie. What was it really like as you saw it?
A very ambivalent relationship, and you see it playing out even to this day. I'll tell you, I guarantee you, Scottie was fuming about that opening episode where Michael said, you know, that he did, you know, about his holdout, and it was selfish and all. You know, Scottie's documentary would only be maybe a part or a half a part, maybe, but when that one comes out, he'll have his last word. So, you know, it was an interesting thing, because Scottie and Horace were tied as close as together. I mean, you couldn't imagine how close two players were. Literally, they lived right close to each other in the neighborhood there, but they bought the same dogs that looked the same way. They bought the same cars. They dressed the same, and they called each other before they came to the games to see what each one was wearing, so they would have matching outfits.
Wow. I didn't know that.
It was uncanny, this incredible relationship. but Scottie was, as everybody happens with everybody, influenced by Michael's celebrity and orbit and the spotlight. And so, you know, sort of like I don't call him a bug, but, you know, sort of like, you know, a moth.
Was he like a puppy dog? Sam, was he kind of like a little puppy dog that followed him around and did what he wanted, or no?
Well, it was, like I said, it was an ambivalence for Scottie, because he would be drawn to that, and he would want to get in Michael's crew and Michael's orbit because it was so exciting and attention, and he came from this small town area. And like I said, it's an incredible story of this guy who was like a Tal kid, and it becomes an NBA star. And so, you know, from rural 2 room, they had 12 people living in 2 rooms. We saw the father and his brother who were medical problems. And so he's influenced by that. Horace is not interested. Horace is a Marine, you know, Johnny Bach, and he were close. He's kind of independent. So Scottie would leave and sort of depart Horace and go off to hang around with Michael. But when you hang around with Michael, you're secondary. There's no equals in Michael's group. There's him, you know, and the rest of them are sort of servants. So when you get to hang around with Michael, you don't get treated like one of the guys, you know, like you're another pro NBA player. You got treated like a subsidiary of Michael Jordan. So then Scottie would be offended by that, and he'd go back to Horace and say, man, it's this guy, you know, he's treating me, he did this, and, you know, but then after a while, you know, he'd be sucked back into Michael. So Scottie was always sort of going back and forth. But, you know, the one thing, and you remember too, Bob, back then there was no, trainer's room. There was no secret private rooms to hide. You know, you got taped right in the locker room in front of everybody. And so I remember all the time, Michael would be in there, and he'd be literally, schooling Scottie Pippen, you know, how to take contact and follow through and finish and still, you know, draw a foul and score. And they were literally doing that, working that out sometimes in the locker room. You know, so Michael recognized Scottie as somebody who was athletic and could help him and would be a part of the team and try to work with him. But Scottie at the same time always had this pull and push about Michael and Michael's orbit and whether to be part of it, and then wanting to be his own individual. So it was a difficult time for Scottie to figure out who he was.
I got a glimpse of that in the Dream Team experience, Sam. They at the bars, the Monte Carlo aspect of it. We spent the week in Monte Carlo before going to Barcelona, and we all were heading to the casino at nights, and Scottie and Michael, of course, loved the casino, as you can well imagine, playing blackjack, and Scottie would not play at Michael's table. He always played at a separate table. I think that was, I picked up on that. It was very telling.
Because he didn't want to get ripped on, you think? You think Michael just would make fun of him?
I think Sam just explained the whole thing. He didn't want to be in the aura again. He needed to be separate. He didn't want to be overshadowed. He didn't, even in that circumstance, something could happen, or he could just feel overwhelmed or I understand that. I picked up on that. Second Scottie thing that I learned along the way that fits into this about who he is, or who he was, I should say. I don't know who he is at the moment. I'm sure he's matured. Is that I was told by someone who knew that he was wearing glasses off the court, except he didn't need glasses. They were clear frames because he thought it made him look more intellectual.
Yes. No, that's true. That's true. I remember. And if you remember too, also, you might not, and Scottie, this was I don't say you go the character flaw, financial, but he was always impressed by money and fame and those kind of things, and he ended up getting in some really terrible investments where his group of people had him buy an airplane, and so you may remember that story where he ended up suing him, trying to get back his money, but he literally bought a jet. He bought a plane. These guys talked him into like a $30 million, and he didn't have the money. Didn't have the money for that. I mean, he's still fighting with the Bulls over what it was. And I know they made a big deal about Scottie and his contract and how badly he was treated. And, but part of Scottie's thing was because of the family issues. But more than that, he had back surgery after his rookie season. And there was a question of whether he'd have a contract, a career at all. So he wanted the 8 years because he didn't think he was going to get 8 years. So he thought 4 years in, he'd be out of the NBA and he'd collect these 4 years for not playing because he was, and of course, management was going to have to pay him. It wasn't like, Ryan Stark's going to be able to go back and say, well, you can't, we don't play you for the last 4 years. But that's why he wanted those long contracts. And then, if you remember in 98 in the finals, he didn't play at the end because his back went out again. And even though he signed that big deal with Houston, that's why that thing didn't work, because he as an effective NBA high level player, that he was done after that surgery. But so he was always caught within that, so impressed by the money and the glamour and wanting that at the same time, but then making some bad decisions with it.
You made a reference earlier about when I brought up the idea of Jerry Krause's role in breaking up the team about Reinsdorf's. What's the deal? How do we differentiate the whole role of the two Jerrys in this process?
Well, let me tell you the real story about the breakup, because they really didn't break up the team. But it's like a lot of stories that we see. It's based on a true story. but more than that, Phil and Michael were always ahead of everybody else in what they saw and how it was operating. And they recognized what was happening. And if you put yourself in, if you look at that situation and look at Michael, now he sees Scottie is already off the rails. He's postponed his surgery that he was going to have in June to September, just so he could purposely miss the first half of the season. Dennis has in the 96-97 finals, when he goes to Salt Lake City and condemns Mormons, gets, still calls them a cult and all this sort of stuff, gets a technical foul in every game of that playoffs. Every single game of the playoffs, he had a technical foul somewhere. So Michael has seen this too. So he's seen Scottie and Dennis are they're going over the edge here. And you heard Michael's reference too. They did the little scene with Dennis going to Las Vegas in the documentary, where Michael says, well, Scottie's out and, now Dennis is going to leave and I'm thinking I'm all alone. you know, okay, Tony Kukoc is there, Ron Harper's there, Luke Long. You know, they had a lot of players, but
Not
this is the
great.
way Michael's viewing the thing. I'm by myself, you know, so Michael, I'm pretty sure after the 96, 97 season, you know, he's built up, he's worn out, you know, he needs to get one more year of that money because he got the $130 million deal. So he's coming back for that year. But I think he recognizes that that thing is over. And what a great thing to fall in his lap that Jerry Krause has manufactured this thing about Phil will never come back. You know, Michael, who's always looking for these motivations, you know, Jeff Van Gundy says I'm a con man, and, you know, Dean Smith wouldn't put me on the cover, and LeBradford Smith, you know, got 30 points and I'm going to come back and, you know, get him. And, you know, so he's, you know, his whole career is manufacturing these slights and insults to motivate him. What great motivation. Jerry Krause is trying to ruin us. And so now he's got something again. Phil recognizes too. Phil had this thing, and he mentioned he had this unusual background. His parents were Pentecostal ministers. Yeah. And he talked about that. And, but part of his thing, and so he grew up in the congregational, parents had congregations, and he always saw his team that way, as this is my congregation. That's why he saw these players as individuals and worked with them individually. And you saw how effective that was and how necessary. But he always said, he talked about a minister with his congregation has 7 years, that they lose, your voice gets lost after that, and it just blends in. So 7 years for him was 96, 95, 96. So he's thinking at the end of 96, I might leave. And that's where this Tim Floyd thing came up, that Tim Floyd in Seattle saw Jerry, because there was nothing to it. So what happened that summer before he went back to Montana, Ron Harper gets a delegation of players, and they go to Phil's house. Can you please come back? You know, we need you and all this stuff. Okay, so he comes back 96, 97. They win again. Well, now Phil is convinced he's done. So Jerry Reinsdorf goes to his house that summer, flies to Montana, never done anything like that before. You know, Phil's up in remote Montana, and they work out a one-year deal. But Jerry tells him, you know, we're going to have a rebuilding coming up at some point here. Michael's 35 and Dennis 36 and Scott, you know, whatever, Scottie's lead. You know, stay around for the rebuilding. No, I don't want any part of rebuilding. You know, that's not what I do. I need a sabbatical. I'll sign for the 1 year. So he recognizes this thing too. You know, obviously Reinsdorf has told Jerry Krause, you know, hey, Phil, this is his last year. He's not going to come back. So Krause, in his inability to both state things, because now he's blamed Phil, and then this is what happened with that. Another of the character flaws of Jerry Krause, not independent of his ability as a scout and a GM, but he hired Phil, and when a time when Phil wasn't getting any traction from the NBA, coaching the CBA, fifth year, nobody's going to hire him. You know how he was viewed in the 70s, the hippie, wrote a book about using drugs. Yep. Maverick, yeah. NBA, he's toxic. Yeah, so Jerry gives him a chance. You know, so, and Phil tried hard, but, you know, I didn't want to give you that mental image before, but, you know, like a thing like Krause did when the players didn't get massages, Jerry would go in and demand a massage in front of all the other players, take off all his clothes to get a massage. Now, that's an image you don't want to keep with you, like you're having dinner later today. You know, so, but that's the stuff he would do. So Phil tried to moderate this thing over the years, and finally, you know, they were sort of coming apart. And Jerry believed that Phil owed him for his life. You know, that, hey, if not for me, you'll be a failure, and you owe me for the rest of your life. And that's not the way it works. Phil came in, did his job, delivered the championships. He didn't owe Jerry anything. It's not the way Jerry viewed the world. So, and the Pippen trade thing was a great example. And you would know that too, Bob. You know, ML Carr, you know, loses every game that season. You know, so the Boston could get Tim Duncan.
15 wins.
15 wins. They get 3 in the lottery. So now Pitino comes in. He's not coaching number 3 in the lot. He's got to play. So he reaches out to the Bulls for Pippen. They should have made this deal. You know, they would have had McGrady, who, again, a small college guy that Jerry had found, was pursuing for years. They would have also had, they had 3-6 with the Boston picks and a veteran. I don't know which veteran it was. So they would have get that. They probably win the next season with that, plus Rodman, Jordan, you know, the team they had. And then they get McGrady going forward, and then they don't have to go back to the bottom like they did. But Reinsdorf even though Jerry kind of agrees to the deal with the Boston, Reinsdorf says, no, you know, if we have a chance to win next season, we're going to keep it together. So, you know, he, like all owners, he's got the last veto. So Reinsdorf kind of kept that together. And then, but Reinsdorf also knowing in 97, 98 that Phil is, you know, he's leaving. He's told me that for personal reasons that makes sense. And I think Michael, because in 92, 93, a lot of people don't realize how at the end of the season, Michael was telling teammates, this is probably the last you've seen of me. You know, he's just worn out from these 2 years and what they've gone through, and Dennis and the celebrity and how big he'd gotten. And he was just ready too. And so, yes, they were breaking up. I don't believe that Jerry Krause and Jerry Reinsdorf instigated that breakup in every way, but that Michael and Phil saw it as the perfect conclusion for that run, that if they come back, now they didn't know that then, but Michael, you know, has his cigar cut during the lockout and can't grip a ball at the rest of that, his right hand, the rest of that season. So wouldn't have been able to shoot probably if he came back. But what if they come back in this mess? Dennis goes to LA, blows that up. Scottie goes to Houston, blows that up. You know, Luke Longley goes to Phoenix, can't play. You know, all this stuff. They go into that next season and they don't make the playoffs. How's the legacy for Michael Jordan then?
Are you looking forward to how they're going to handle Michael's baseball hiatus in this documentary?
Well, you know, I'm pretty sure Michael has had approval of what it is. So you know, the other thing about Michael's baseball thing, it wasn't as bad as it was portrayed to be. He really worked at it. That first year was pretty bad. He didn't play well. And he actually, amazingly enough to all of us, he had no power. That was the amazing thing. Mm-hmm. You know, he couldn't hit home runs. You know, this big, strong athlete, you know, figure, you know, bigger than everybody. You know, he just couldn't get the ball that far out. But then when he went to the Winter League in Arizona, he actually played pretty well. And not just for publicity purposes, the scouts were saying, you know, that he's got a really good chance of being a September call-up in the 95 season. That not for the strike. They had a baseball strike still going on, and they wanted to make him a replacement player. And that's why he left then. He wouldn't have come back in 95 at that time unless that was going on in baseball. But he really thought he could get to the majors, and they were telling him that, hey, you know, it's not a publicity stunt anymore. So I think there'll be more of that in it. That they'll legitimize it a little bit.
I think more about the motivation for it, the real reasons. You know,
the real reason was he was burned out from and I'm not saying the Jordan rules. That was sort of part of the start, but all the gambling thing that developed. You know, and I don't know if they'll go into that because, you know, you can imagine in this era, he skips a trip to the White House and he says, hey, I met, this was George Bush 1. He said, I met him when he was vice president. I know him. And he said, I got a family trip. And, you know, he's having a press conference saying this. You know, I've scheduled a family trip because they're going to do it before the start of the season. You know, in 91, they win. Everybody disperses. So right before the start of camp, they were going to go in the White House. And so he says, well, I had a family trip planned, and it can't force you to go because it's before the season started. So he says, I got a family trip, and family's even more important than the president. And oh yeah, Michael Jordan trip. So, okay, then it turns out he goes to a gambling weekend. We didn't know that, but when we found out that because the bail bondsman who was financing the weekend got murdered. And among the participants was a convicted drug dealer. Now, Michael, this was unbeknownst to Michael, who he was going to play with, but, you know, if you're going to an illegal gambling weekend, it's probably not going to be high school science teachers there. Except maybe that, you know, USA series of the drug dealing teacher. So now this blows up, you know, with Slim Buller, who was the drug dealer and all this sort of stuff. And then, you know, then this guy comes out in California, said Michael Welch, they wrote a book, Michael Welch done all these golf debts, over $1 million. Yep. And then we go to New York in the playoffs, and he goes to Atlantic City between games. And the New York Times of all, Dave Anderson, the wonderful, calm Dave Anderson is outraged at how can Michael Jordan do the right big stories. The New York Times is, this is such a horror. I remember being asked about it, and he said, well, he went between games and he got home at 2. I said, that's unbelievable. He usually gets in at 5. And then he scores 48 points. So,
Yeah.
And the other part of it was, he had been, like I said, he had been this most accommodating, open. You'd come into Chicago and you'd walk and sit down in the locker for an hour. You didn't make an appointment. It wasn't like that with Larry. It wasn't like, maybe Magic was the only one. But Michael was like that too. You could walk in, unannounced, sit down, and he'll talk to you for an hour, talk to anybody, local radio station. He was just the best to deal with.
Yeah.
And so now he's feeling like, hey, after all these years, I accommodated every one of you guys, did everything, did every appearance, every walk-off interview, everything. And this is the way you treat me? This is what you give me, all this. And he wasn't kicked out of the league. The league wanted, trust me, the league wanted no part of that investigation. They wanted no part of losing their biggest moneymaker and biggest attraction. And we at the Tribune, after it happened, we started doing an investigation, and we go down and they interviewed Slim Buller. It was our investigative reporters. And everywhere they went, they said, well, what did the NBA investigators ask you? They said, well, we haven't heard from anyone from the NBA. They didn't talk to anybody. They didn't want to hear any of this. There was nothing involving pushing Michael Jordan out of the NBA. But then, so he was burned out, and his father, and actually he had talked to George Shinn back in the late 80s about playing for one of, he had a minor league team in Charlotte when he owned the team down there. And he talked to Jerry Reinsdorf because his dad always talked about baseball. And he wanted Michael to be a baseball player when he was young. And they had toyed with this idea, but could never work it out about playing a summer of A-ball. And then so he's burned out. And then when his father got murdered, he's like, you know what? Enough is enough. Let me get away from this. And that's what baseball was about.
So have you been surprised that he's stepped away completely and hasn't been the limelight? Like with Larry, I expected this, right? Larry, not a guy that really wanted to deal with people that much. I'm not saying Michael's magic. Nobody's magic, right? In wanting all the adulation and needing to be around people all the time. But I've been surprised that Michael has taken such a step back, because he does like the attention, or he did like the attention so much. And now he's just kind of an owner who's got nothing to do with it, really. I mean, surprised or no?
I'm surprised about that he's come back to this level. I never expected to see this. Actually, to me, for the public, the best parts is seeing him relaxed, open, talking, joking, looking at the thing with Isiah Thomas, and just like he would with his friends. Bullshit, there's no way. That's who he is. And that's who I never expected to see ever again. I didn't think anybody would see that again, because he had become such a recluse. Yeah. The truth was, while he liked the acclaim, he didn't like the acclaim. I remember even in the 80s, when he still wasn't winning anything and he was gone, he would say to us, you guys don't realize, you don't appreciate what this is. You guys can go grocery shopping or go to a movie, and I can't. I say, well, I wish somebody could go grocery shopping for me. I don't like doing that. But he always was moaning about, the lack of privacy. And he had said many times, he said, when I remember a lot of these too, even in the first championship run in the early 90s, he said, when I leave, you guys will never see me again. I'll never be around. And that's what he was holding to. And so I'm more surprised that he came back, because look, he's got a new family. He remarried, got young babies. In fact, I ran into, and again, I think you asked me before, I'm not close to him in any way. None of us are. But he's always cordial. We saw him in Charlotte a couple of times, and hey, how you doing? And with me, he said, hey, we work for the Bulls now. You sold out. You're on the other side. That kind of stuff. But so, I said, hey, he said, yeah, I just got back from changing diapers, and and so he's built a golf course down there, and I think he lives in Jupiter, where all the golf pros live. And he's built this private course, it's supposedly spectacular. It's $200,000 initiation fees, and of course, it's got a waiting list. And so I'm shocked he's doing this. The notion is, well, people said, well, he was jealous that LeBron's getting so much attention. I don't buy that stuff. I don't know exactly why he's doing it, but what surprises me, he's come back out. We've never seen him in Chicago. He's never, the only time he's ever been here, I could remember since '98, was for that memorial for Johnny Kerr, and he came in for that. But other than that, he's never been here. And even at the All-Star game this year, he didn't make an appearance.
It's amazing.
Of all places. He could have walked out and got his huge standing ovation. He didn't have to talk to anybody, but we never saw him. So,
yeah.
We'll leave you on this last thing. Your favorite Michael story. Your favorite. It can be anything, for good, for bad, for ugly, whatever it was. What is the story that you will always kind of remember? If you're telling your kids, your grandkids, I cover Michael Jordan. What is it?
I obviously don't have one because I got so many, just like Bob would. I took one of them they showed, was one of my favorites, was in that documentary where we were at Game 5, which was really a turning point then. They lose that. Cleveland, as Bob knows, was supposed to be the team in the 90s, not the Bulls. They were Mark Price and Brad Daugherty with the pick and roll, Ron Harper, the great athlete, Larry Nance. They had everything.
Hot Plate Williams.
Yeah,
not Plate. Plate was bigger than Rod. Remember?
Rod. Yeah. So as he said, and it's true, the Cavs won all six games that season. And what he did mention was Game 6. It's back in the Chicago. The Cavs, everything's clinched, and it's 3-6. Cavs are going to play them that season. I mean, in the playoffs. So it's the last game of the season. Cavs play nobody. Play all their reserves. The Bulls play all their starters, like 40-some minutes, and the Cavs blow them out. Randolph Keys, if Bob remembers, is like 30. And so we're thinking, there's no way. They got no shot at this team. There's no way they can beat this team. But I'm thinking, I figured it's Michael Jordan there. They'll steal a couple of games. Now, Cavs got some injuries, which turned things on. But, okay, so he walks into that, and who does that before the game? Larry, game's about to start, this great moment, team may be broken up, all this sort of stuff. And he's going, I'll kick your ass and I'll kick your ass. And so that was when I remember, I was telling my son this one. He was like 6 months old. This was in 89. I'd had him with me and we had a practice. And so he's a baby and I'm holding him, but my wife was off somewhere and I had to bring him. So I got the tape recorder out and I'm listening to interview and my son, the baby, is playing with the tape recorder, grabbing the tape recorder. And so I look at Michael and I said, see, he doesn't care much for you. He said, give him 6 months. So, not only always had the last word, one thing I don't want to go into it in detail, they will, but it was sort of like, and I felt badly about it. I'll just go quickly. And I've kind of defended Michael on this in recent, this Republicans buy sneakers too thing, which the world has cheap shotted him on. It wasn't a political statement. If Bob remembers the 80s, because of the salary cap, the NBA wasn't in trouble. The players were basically in agreement, hey, we're not going to be controversial about issues like this. Even Kareem, who boycotted the 68 Olympics, sat with Ali, when he was kicked out of boxing. You didn't hear from Kareem about it. Nobody was doing that stuff. And so I'd worked in politics. I'd worked in Washington. And so it was a hobby, stuff I knew. Actually spent a short time with a U.S. Senator as his press secretary, Lowell Weicker from Connecticut. I was on his staff. So I would talk to him, I would bring up these subjects with Michael, and he didn't want to deal with it. So, it was like a beat it, Sam Smith. It's like a last word quip. And it's been turned into a political philosophy that's been unfairly used against him. But that was the nature too. Michael always had a great last line. Whatever you said, he could usually top you with, with kind of a quip or a joke. Just so sharp that way. And at least, on that one, I'm sure that's going to come out somewhere in this documentary. And, people have been beating them over the head with this over the years. And it's really hypocritical because, whatever else anyone else is doing, this was not, him just selling out for the money.
All right, both of you, I'm going to let you leave on this one, both of you. The greatest player in NBA history is blank.
Yeah, Michael Jordan, of course.
I always have to have the differentiation. You have to put all the centers in another, when there were really centers.
Only Bob, I asked him a simple question. The
best, better.
The best, when you say greatest player, you're talking about mastering, I call it master of the game, all the arts of the game, passing, dribbling, shooting, defense, competitiveness, et cetera, and it's restricted to guys between 6'5" and 6'9". Okay, that's just the way it is. The answer is Michael Jordan, and very simple reason is this: if I'm playing for my life tonight, the greatest competitor, it's Michael Jordan. That's the answer. That's my answer.
Let me add one thing, and Bob and I actually could do a podcast on this, because to me, and I always, not always, but get into this debate about the greatest guard and whatever, but the greatest point guard to me, because the guy who dominated the game from all elements at his position was Oscar Robertson. Now, unfortunately, he was playing against the greatest team and by far the greatest executive in the history of the game. What Red Auerbach did to put together those Celtics teams in the 60s transcends anything anybody's did. The vision he had, and to unite Bill Russell with the pieces he had. And Oscar essentially had to play against that. But Oscar, offensively, defensively, athletically, intelligence-wise, IQ, to me was sort of the perfect NBA player.
Human clinic of basketball.
Right.
Oscar.
Right. And it doesn't get the credit for, everyone says those Magic's are great. And Magic's great, I agree. But I would always take Oscar.
Oh, that's not.
He just didn't have the team and was playing against the greatest dynasty ever.
No, he was a clinic. And I was told, if you want to, I once had a mentor in basketball who said, if you want to learn how to dribble, watch Oscar. If you want to learn how to shoot, watch Oscar. If you want to learn how to position for rebound, watch Oscar. And, he was a clinic without question. And people like us need to keep that name in front of people so they don't forget him when these discussions are held.
Sam, listen, we really appreciate you joining us. Have the book sales spiked again? Have you gotten kind of a second wind here of Jordan Rules?
Well, let me tell you something about that. I'm making exactly the same on book sales as I am from doing this podcast because it's out of print. So there's no more copies available.
Right?
It's not selling at all.
Is that true? There's no more copies available.
No, it's out of print, and they're not printing more from what I was told.
Oh,
so,
Sam, we got to get on this. This is a lost opportunity.
As Bob would know, as somebody who's written books, the publishing industry knows very little about selling books.
Yeah, don't get me started.
Exactly.
Listen, Sam.
Meanwhile, people, maybe they can find this one, folks.
There you go. There you go.
A lot of Oscar.
Okay, there you go.
I'm going to read the Jordan Rules again, probably once the 10 episodes are over. But listen, we really, I know how busy you are. Bob knows how busy you are.
Hey, this is great.
This was fun. Honestly, these are the best for me. I hope you guys enjoy talking to each other because I'm just here along for the ride and really enjoy hearing the stories because I was, in my teens and 20s, really watching this thing and hearing the inside of all the stories from both of you. Listen, I could sit here all day long.
Well,
so
Jeff,
I appreciate it.
You do great work, but it was always such an honor for me to be with Bob. So I'm glad to be able to.
Thanks. It's great to see you again.
No, we know that's why you did it. Don't worry. You're not offending me at all. But I appreciate it, guys, and be safe. And thanks again, Sam.
Yeah, thank you.